Hello and welcome to the Lessons from Auschwitz podcast. My name is Ivana.
And my name's Nosheen.
And we're both history students that took part in the Lessons from Auschwitz project.
We are here to pass on our knowledge about the Holocaust because we're the last generation to witness survivors, and we believe that the school curriculum could improve with the way that they teach students about this historical event. Our main goal of this podcast is to inform and educate about the Holocaust.
We also want to put faces to the statistic of 6 million people and help understand the individual experiences that people had during this moment of history. Welcome to episode 1. We will be focusing on pre-war Jewish life and going to the camps.
Prior to the podcast, we did a survey and we sent it out to Year 12s in our school. 50 people answered, and the survey was about how confident people were about the Holocaust. 30 out of 50 people said that they only knew basic knowledge about the Holocaust. This entails things such as the 6 million Jews or the fact that the Nazis created the camps.
Yeah, and we really think that this statistic shows that people have very basic understanding because they don't do in-depth study or they don't do in-depth teaching about this topic.
Yeah, and I just feel as though the way that they might bring in a survivor into the school or join a webinar to listen to a survivor's story, all that gets cancelled out by the fact that they're only teaching numbers. They're not teaching stories. They're not teaching the ins and outs of what happened. So these students, they only know the 6 million. They only know that number. They don't know the people. They don't know what happens.
Yeah.
And that's something that needs to change.
Definitely. I think that statistic of 6 million Jewish people, it's so impossible to imagine. It's like dehumanizing and limiting these people of history of just a number.
Yeah, and I just think throughout this podcast we're going to be mentioning words such as dehumanizing and humanizing, because I think it's more important to make sure that people understand that these were real people. They weren't numbers. And
definitely
throughout their whole time in the camps, their main goal was to make sure that they didn't get dehumanized by these people.
Yeah, and that's why we definitely wanted to focus on pre-war Jewish life, because a lot of people assume that Nazis originated anti-Semitism, but that's not true. And we wanted to focus on about how anti-Semitism really started off as religious hatred, and it goes back to Jesus's time when people blamed Jewish people for the crucifixion of Jesus, and it was related to a religious hatred rather than a race hatred.
Yeah, and I think when we were both in the actual course itself, Lessons from Auschwitz, I think we were both shocked to figure out that things such as, the star that the Jews had to wear, anti-Semitism itself, it didn't start from the Nazis. I was so shocked to find out that things such as the star being worn, that stemmed from way back then, all those years ago when Jesus was crucified. It's mind-boggling in a way.
Yeah, definitely.
People just like to throw the blame onto something like the Nazis, and they didn't start this. They just continued it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of the time, Jewish people who lived in Germany, even prior to Nazis coming into power, they were ashamed of their culture and they assimilated. And that essentially means that they wouldn't wear traditional Jewish wear, or they wouldn't marry Jewish people, and they assimilated into the society by marrying Christians and not practicing their religion, but rather assimilating by choosing not to be proud of their religion.
And that's just a really sad thing, because obviously that's part of their life. But the thing is that even though they tried to kind of get away from their religion, they were always seen as a Jew, because Jews were seen as a race, an inferior race at that.
Yeah.
And it's just, I don't know, it's just crazy to me that they tried so hard to get away from everything that was, harming them, and then they just had to live with it again, because even though they didn't really believe in their religion anymore, they will always be seen as a Jew.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the time people will assume that when Nazis came to power, it was like, boom, straight away, Jewish people in camps. But it wasn't an overnight thing. It definitely was a gradual thing. I think Nazi ideology and anti-Semitism, you can definitely see it from the beginning. And that slow progression with the Nuremberg laws of slowly taking away Jewish rights, of making them live in ghettos, completely like limiting them from their normal life.
Yeah, and I just think like the ideology behind it all, and like things such as their reasoning for the camps, I don't think they intended to just get rid of Jews from day one.
Yeah.
It was always like keeping them away from society because they believed in the Aryan race, and obviously the Jews didn't exactly fit into that.
Yeah.
But then it slowly began to become something like, let's get rid of all the Jews. We don't want them here anymore. We want to eradicate them.
Yeah.
And they even wanted to just get rid of the idea that there were camps at all, that there were Jews at all. They wanted to make it seem as though there were no Jews at all from the start.
Yeah, and that genuinely was the purpose of the Holocaust, was to completely erase Jewish people from history. And that's why a lot of survivors and a lot of people aren't remembered. And that number, 6 million, it's not even an accurate representation of the amount of people they just completely erased from existence.
Yeah, like there could be millions more, like even billions, we don't know.
Definitely.
And they're still trying to find people to this day. In the Book of Names, for example, that Book of Names isn't complete yet. There's still millions of Jews who are undiscovered, millions of Jews whose stories we don't know. And that's why we're kind of doing this podcast. We want to find out more about these people. We want to shed light to them.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, to elaborate, the Book of Names is a remembrance of Jewish people that were killed in the Holocaust. And it is quite literally just a book of their names. And it's only got 4 million or 4.6 million of people, but it's still missing like 1.5 million people.
It's crazy to think. Like, obviously, they found most of the people, and they're all written in the book. But the fact that there's over 1 million, almost 2 million names that no one knows about, no one understands their pain and suffering.
Yeah.
They've been forgotten.
Mm-hmm.
And soon this is going to happen to the other 4 million that have been found. If we don't teach people the proper way if we don't teach people about the Holocaust in a better way, we're just going to forget about these people. And it's just, I can't describe.
Yeah, it's devastating, isn't it? Like, because a lot of people's families and their surnames will be in this book of names, and it's like, well, I don't want my family history to be erased, and I don't want my family to be forgotten about.
Yeah, and the book of names, it only has the names. It doesn't describe what happened to them.
Yeah.
And I don't know how I feel about that. I just feel like there could be more.
Definitely.
Okay, so trying to get back on the topic, let's speak more about anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm Nosheen, by the way. I'm a Muslim, so obviously I have a lot of, religious background, cultural background. And I don't know, when I think about the Jews and what they had to go through when they had to assimilate and when they had to experience anti-Semitism, I don't know, it's mind-boggling. And I just feel like, as a Muslim, if someone told me, like, you need to get rid of your religion, you need to get rid of your whole identity, essentially, in order to fit in, I would be like, what?
Exactly, because it like almost strips you away from your identity. I think a religion, especially like passed on generations, where Jewish people would go to the synagogue with their family, and they would practice different religions with different practices and festivals and traditions, and that being taken away, I think it definitely it's like the beginning of the stripping of their identity, even before the camps.
Yeah, I just think I can't even describe it. Like, the fact that they had to get rid of their identity, like, nowadays you would laugh at that fact. Like, if someone tells you get rid of your whole identity, like, in order to fit in, you would be like, what?
Yeah.
Like, even little things such as, like, clothing.
Yeah. And
someone tells you shouldn't be wearing that, we would laugh it off. They're getting rid of their whole identity. Like, for me, being Muslim is a lot of my identity.
Yeah.
Some people might not be able to understand that, that's okay. But for me, other religious people, not even religious people, maybe if you're part of a different community, like the LGBT community, that's part of your identity. Like, things like that. And someone tells you, stop being who you are, essentially. That's what they're doing.
Yeah.
We would laugh in their face. And I can't believe that the Jews had to basically get rid of their whole identity these people, like these real people,
Mm-hmm.
just to become German.
Yeah, and I think that's where it's kind of like really shocking, is because Germany now is so multicultural and so different to how it was before. I think the multicultural aspect of it is so crucial, and I think that the idea of a ghetto and a certain like race and religion being closed off to one part of their own country. And it's not like a ghetto today where a lot of people of a similar culture will live in one place. No, it was literally a wall built around this place, and they weren't allowed to leave, and they had a curfew. They weren't allowed to do basic human things.
It was a prison. It was literally a prison, and they didn't do anything wrong. The only thing they did wrong in the eyes of the Nazis, in the eyes of anti-Semites, is the fact that they had a different religion to them.
Yeah.
That they might have looked a bit different. And I think it's ironic because, you know, there's the rumours about Hitler and the fact that he might not even be, you know, he might be Jewish. Like, he might have Jewish ancestry.
Yeah.
It's weird to me. Like, they're just a person. They did nothing wrong. And to steal a quote from what the Germans said when the Treaty of Versailles was signed by the Weimar Republic, they were stabbed in the back. No, they stabbed the Jews in the back because the Jews did a lot of things for Germany.
Definitely,
They were extremely influential, and the things that they brought to Germany and their culture and things such as, you know, their work.
Yeah, I think it was like a lot of doctors and lawyers and businessmen, and most people that owned banks were Jewish as well. And I think it was, like we said, it was a gradual change of that anti-Semitism being more prevalent. But it's the fact that people generally accepted it. And linking back to the ghettos, I think people knew that the Nazis were anti-Semitic and that people were closed off in their own homes in the ghettos. Germans generally just accepted it.
Yeah, and like things such as, say for example, the 1936 Olympics. This sounds like it's going off topic. I promise it links. I just think the fact that they could just pretend that nothing was happening, and then everyone just kind of pretended nothing was happening, and they just put out a persona that Germany was amazing, Germany was great.
Yeah.
But there's Jews that were suffering in that time period. Mm-hmm. It's crazy to think that. And yeah.
And I think, like, there's obviously a lot to consider when it comes to, like, a dictatorship and fascism and how much power you have living in that kind of society. Because you don't have any power if you're a citizen of a dictatorship. But there is definitely a certain sort of power or almost responsibility you have to see this and try to change it.
But the thing is that they would never change it because they kind of accepted this new lifestyle from going from the Weimar Republic to this dictatorship because they were desperate. They knew that things weren't going as well as they should be in Germany, and they just accepted what was happening because they didn't want to get hurt.
Yeah.
They didn't want to turn out like the Jews or the Sinti Roma people or the gays or the disabled people. They didn't want to turn out like them.
Yeah.
So they're just going to accept it and sit back and observe, essentially.
Yeah, and definitely. I think the power of the Nazis was literally just taking away everyone else's power. That's where their power came from. And that is so prevalent in Jewish people that literally their power was stripped away and they were just limited to nothing almost.
Although they had their power stripped away from them, they still had the power of community, the power of their family. And whilst being in the ghetto, they kind of were very linked together.
Definitely.
And I feel like we can use
Elie Wiesel's
book Night to kind of explain how they felt whilst being in the ghetto. And even though they were in quite a tremendously hard time, they still had each other. And they still, they played like little children. Their families came round with recipes in hand, things like that. And I just think that that's really beautiful. It's nice to find something beautiful in
hard times.
In hard times.
Yeah, and I think the book is a very honest depiction and account of the a Holocaust survivor's experience, because it directly goes from the ghettos to the camps. And I think his idea of community is very prevalent at the beginning when they're all together, like Nasheen said, is like they did still continue living, and it was like that sort of almost like a resistance in a way. Yeah, I think though regardless of what they're being told, they still continued their religions and traditions of, say, having Passover or having the Sabbath on a Saturday and just being together.
Yeah, and I just think they managed, this is like the start of them having to humanize themselves in a time where they were being dehumanized. And their struggles just continued for years and years. And, you know, I think this was kind of, like I said, the start. It's just the start of what they had to go through. And they were dealing with it pretty well, despite all the hardships, despite their power being stripped away. They managed to still live.
Yeah, and that definitely highlights their strength and perseverance as a community and being together. Yeah. And I think this would be a good way to sort of lead into a specific survivor story that we've prepared. So we've got the story of Marla Hilfgott. Yeah, she grew up in Czechoslovakia and she was just a regular young teenage girl, and she had to move to the ghettos at a very young age. And her story is that she hid with friends at their house with her cousin Igia, and she was taken at this house to hide from Nazis who would do checkups in the ghettos, and they would round up people, Jewish people, and essentially just shoot them. They would take them to a forest, just shoot them. So that's why Marla hid with her cousin in like a friend's house, and they had to be there for like a few months, and her cousin really desperately wanted to go see her parents. So Igia decided she wanted to leave to be taken back to her parents. And then a few months later, Marla went back to the ghetto with her parents and her uncle, but she never saw her cousin, and she never saw her cousin again because she just disappeared. I think no one really found out what happened, and Igia, her dad, Marla's uncle, found out his daughter disappeared, and he went white in the face, and because he was in such shock, like, where is my daughter? And Igia was never heard from again. And I think something like that, like a person like unaccounted for disappearing, it's insane. And so Marla stayed in the ghetto with her mum and her father. And a few months later, her mum and her 8-year-old sister were rounded up and shot in the ghetto. And I think that, like, idea of just someone just so easily, a life being taken, a mother, a child, a sister. Like, what do you think about that?
I just think it's crazy.
Yeah.
That's the one word that I'm going to continue saying. It's crazy. It's seemingly unbelievable, but the thing is that it happened.
Mm-hmm.
I just imagine the fact that you'll never see this person again, and you just have to live with it.
Yeah.
Like, I remember listening to this story whilst doing the project, because we got to listen to her story personally.
Yeah.
And it was just crazy. The way that she's had to live with this for the rest of her life, not knowing where her cousin is, and knowing that, you know, her mum and her sister aren't there anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I can't even imagine how it would feel if that was me or if that was you, Ivana.
Yeah, exactly. I think the idea of your own family member completely disappearing, because Marla and her family never got closure. All these years later, they never ever got closure about what happened to Igia, where she went. And I think that happened to so many people. It was not single to Marla. Like, so many people and their family completely unaccounted for where they went. Like, like Nasheen said, it's literally insane. Like, someone just disappearing from history.
Yeah, and I think if we look at the Book of Names, things like this, we can't trust things like the statistics. We can't trust numbers. And again, this is why it's so important to teach the Holocaust properly. Because numbers are numbers, and they can change, and they can be more, they can be less. And the fact that there's so many people like Marla's cousin who just disappeared. Where have they gone?
Yeah.
You can't just have a number because, you know, there's people who went missing, so we don't know if they're alive. We don't know if they passed away.
Yeah.
Like, we don't know what happened to them.
Definitely. And so, to continue on with her story, after Marla's mum and her sister were shot, she had to take care of Anne Helfgott, which was her 5-year-old cousin, and they were both sent to Ravensbrück, a concentration camp, and 10 weeks later they were transported to Bergen-Belsen, which was like cruel camp. I think it wasn't as deadly as Auschwitz-Birkenau, but it definitely was. Like, Bergen-Belsen was a cruel camp where they would have been living in disgusting conditions, and for this reason Marla contracted typhus and incredibly disgusting diseases because of these conditions. Luckily for Marla, they didn't stay too long in the camp because it was later freed when they were freed by the British, and she was sent to Sweden, where she moved 2 years later. She moved to England, and Marla found her brother and they reunited as a family. But I think they're never ever going to get that closure of Marla's cousin and her family and her mum and her sister.
Yeah, closure is always a thing that we all want in life. Like, whether it be, you know, you're watching a show on Netflix and then it gets cancelled and you never know what happens again.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's quite, you know, you can't really compare the two because one is not as important as the other, of course. But we know, like, as humans, we always want closure for things.
Definitely, yeah.
And the fact that they didn't get closure over such a big thing as someone going missing, they never found out where she went. And they will never know, probably.
Yeah.
And that's terrifying. Imagine someone you love in your life, they go missing and you never find out what happened to them. Like, I would at least like to know if, like, you know, if they're passed on and they are somewhere that I can go visit them.
Yeah, yeah. And I think also, just imagining that happening to you, I think a lot of the time people sort of really want a legacy. Like, they really want to leave something behind so that even after their death, they are remembered. And I think someone like Ijia, who disappeared and we don't know what happened to her, she will never have that option of leaving a legacy, leaving something behind her, because it's just been wiped out. And I think that's why Marla is so, like, important to tell her story, to tell what happened to her family, because it's not single to her. I think it's very, very, like, normal for a lot of Jewish people, and Holocaust survivors experience something like that.
But the thing is that one day Marla's not going to be here anymore. And that's a terrifying thought as well, because that means her memory could possibly be forgotten about, and that's terrifying. That's crazy to think about.
Yeah.
But obviously we're not going to think about that until she's passed, until all of these Holocaust survivors have passed. We're not going to think about that because we as humans, we're quite weak or ignorant, as you could say, and we don't really realise things until they're gone.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's also true. It's like you're not really appreciative of something.
Yeah.
Or someone until they are gone.
And that's just the human nature of humans. Yeah. So we've got another survivor story prepared. His name was Jacob Wasserman, and he was born in February 1926 in Krakow, Poland. Jacob was the eldest of 3 sons and was born to religious Jewish parents in the city of Krakow. His father was a flour merchant. In March 1939, he celebrated his bar mitzvah, And a bar mitzvah is basically when you become of age in Judaism, and he was 13.
Yeah.
That summer, his family vacationed as usual in his grandfather's farm near Prosovitz. They returned to a nightmare, as they described. Krakow had been occupied by the Germans on September 6th of that year. Jews were not allowed to walk on the sidewalks, to ride streetcars, or even own radios.
Yeah.
And Jacob and his family were even afraid to walk in the streets because many Jews were kidnapped and beaten if they were out. In 1940, Jacob's family retreated to the farm. And early one Saturday, the Jews in the area were rounded up. They were marched into Prosovitz when a Polish policeman, 2 dead bodies next to him, motioned to Jacob, demanding why he hadn't greeted him good morning, something as simple as a good morning.
Yeah.
As Jacob came closer to the policeman loaded his gun and pointed it at him. But as Jacob passed, the policeman bashed him with the barrel, smashing his nose and jaw. Jacob broke away and lost himself in the column. The policeman shot someone else instead. 4 days later, Jacob and his father were deported to the Prokosim camp. Jacob spent the rest of the war in labour camps, and in 1947 he attempted to immigrate illegally to Palestine, but he was detained in Cyprus by the British. But eventually he settled in Israel in 1948, so he was a survivor.
Yeah, I think the idea of him and his family generally just doing something as normal as going on vacation, going on holiday, and then coming back to Nazi occupation, and a complete switch for their life. Like, in Germany, I think that is the difference, because in Germany, they did have that gradual progression of Jewish people losing rights, but occupied countries such as Poland, which was one of the first countries to become occupied by Nazis, it wasn't as gradual. It was almost like, boom, Nazi occupation, you are now living a different life, a different lifestyle. You can't go back to that normality.
You're a prisoner.
Yeah. And I think even though Jacob did settle in Israel after the war, he's forever going to live with that idea of, he's never going to go back to how he was pre-Nazi occupation. And that's the same with Marla. And a lot of these survivors, I think, the key thing of survivors is it puts a face to the statistics. And you're not picturing just a number anymore, you're picturing a person. With a
face.
Yeah, exactly. With a family, with a life, for being seen as just a Jewish victim of the war.
Yeah, and stories like Jacob's and stories like Marla's, it really just teaches us that their lives were real.
Yeah.
It wasn't fake, like Holocaust deniers claim to be. And if we continue to teach things like as they are now, just statistics, it just allows more and more Holocaust deniers to be able to relish in their
beliefs. Yeah. Like, the idea that, he just was like a regular Jewish boy who had his bar mitzvah at 13, and a tradition that's still practiced by Jewish people today, and their tradition, and then him just having to deny himself and experiencing that brutality at such a young age is definitely really disgusting and would have been traumatizing.
Yeah. It's, again, like I've said like 10 times already, it's crazy.
Yeah. I think the idea that a lot of Holocaust survivors don't want to talk about their experience immediately is very, very real because of that trauma. It's something that you carry with you in yourself, and it for the rest of your life, and the people you lost, you probably carry for the rest of your life because you can't ever forget them. So what we hope you take away today listening to this episode is really putting a face to the idea of 6 million Jewish people and trying to understand trying to understand what they could have went through and their life before and during the war.
And I think even if it might have gone over your head or you might have forgotten a few things that we've said, the one thing I feel like needs to get drilled into your minds is that the statistic is not enough.
Yeah.
And that we, like, the bare minimum should be that we know the stories of a few people.
Definitely, I think, because that's like the biggest mistake when teaching the histories fully, to just define the Holocaust as 6 million Jewish people. But it was so much more than that. And I think this is what we've achieved today, is by explaining these people's stories and really going into detail about their experiences before also.
Yeah.
So we thank you for listening to episode 1.
And we hope you enjoyed.